The new school's hot bully wants to get with me so badly. It was safe to say that my after-school plans had terribly derailed. Instead of checking out the new city and its sights, I was stuck in a ring of sweaty, screaming teenagers fighting for my life. I was presently cornered by some brute twice my size. He seemed hell-bent on being the one who knocked out the new guy. Real classy. This one, like all the other clowns before him, had been after me since I set foot in this school 2 weeks ago. Why? Because my reputation had a bad habit of preceding me. Damon Baxter. Everyone knew my name and was terribly aware of who I was. It got so bad in middle school that even teachers began to use my name to freak the other kids out into doing their homework and falling in line. Things eventually got out of hand when I overdid it and ended up getting expelled, but that's a story for another time. Now, every folk like this idiot had somehow gotten it into their heads that putting me on my back would be their ticket to high school stardom. So much for starting afresh here. I wiped the blood from the corner of my mouth. It was yet another thing to add to the endless list of things ruining my day. "You hit like a little girl," I chuckled, trying to get under his skin. He didn't bother replying. He was too concerned with trying and failing to balance on his feet. I had been slowly picking at him, hitting him where it hurt the most, and right now, his right eye was swollen shut, and the way he was staggering clearly told me he didn't have much more left in him. He desperately did not want to be the one who lost to the new guy. That was the only thing still keeping him in this fight. "Hey, break it up right now!" I jumped back as Mrs. Henderson, our biology teacher, began making her way over from the end of the crowded hallway. All the gathered students, including my battered victim, broke out into scattered runs as they tried to get away from the scene as quickly as possible. School fights were cool and all, but getting detention because of them was simply not worth it. Just as I turned to take my leave, I locked gazes with a pair of blue eyes that had been watching this altercation aloofly since the very beginning with that insufferable smirk on his face. The impending arrival of Mrs. Henderson didn't even faze him in the least bit, and it wouldn't have moved me too, but I would have to spin one hell of a tale to explain my bloody knuckles to her and the principal. Speaking of bloody knuckles, this hadn't even been the fight I'd been looking for. The one I really wanted was the clown staring at me with that stupid look on his face. Jaxon Strauss. Now he was worth beating into the ground. He was the one everyone at the school feared. I wasn't too keen on finding out the exact details of what he'd done to earn his reputation here, but I had a pretty good idea. You see, Jaxon here was basically me in my old school, but cranked up a few notches. People often called me a bully, a delinquent, but that couldn't have been farther from the truth. I didn't go after the weak. Nah, that was for people with no imagination. I had a more refined palate. I liked taking down the bullies. Turning the tables on them was beyond satisfying. And Jaxon Strauss, he was ripe for the taking. 2 weeks ago. The first day at a new school for me was supposed to be all about staying under the radar, checking out the scene, figuring out who's who, and maybe seeing where I could stir up a little trouble unseen. That was the plan. Simple enough, right? But it all went out the window the moment I stepped foot in Redwood High and crossed paths with Jaxon Strauss. He wasn't the kind of guy you can miss. Broad shoulders, messy dark hair, and that look, the one that made it clear he ran this place without even trying. I hadn't even been there for up to an hour, but talk about him reached me as I struggled to locate my locker. Back at my old school, I was the one people got out of the way for. I didn't need to make friends or play nice. I ruled the halls easily, and since the teachers were grateful for how I made the other kids behave, no one challenged me. But here, things were different. Jaxon was already that guy, the one everyone feared, the one everyone knew not to cross. And it irked me so. The first time we actually ran into each other, nothing dramatic happened initially. He walked past me in the hallway, shot me a smirk, and I raised an eyebrow in return. That was it. But his smirk told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't going to be easy. Jaxon wasn't just another guy who thought he was tough. He knew he was, and that made it a bit of a challenge. "You don't seem like much of a tough guy, numbnuts," Jaxon called out over his shoulders as he walked by, not bothering to even look in my direction. I was too stunned by the numbnut remark to put together an immediate reply, so Jaxon took the liberty of continuing his little welcome speech. "I honestly expected more when I heard the Damon Baxter was coming to my yard, but now that I see you in person, I must say, I'm not very impressed. The class bells chose that moment to go off, dispersing the growing crowd and impending altercation. Jaxon continued off to class without a care in the world. If I had the slightest clue as to which direction my next class was, then I might have spared a few seconds to shoot him a death glare, but alas, that was not the case. 4 days later. By the end of my first week at Redwood High, two things were crystal clear. Jackson Strauss was an arrogant jerk who needed to be knocked down a peg, and I was the one to do it. I wasn't here to blend in. I wanted to take his throne and crush it. Our rivalry heated up faster after that first hallway encounter. It started with glares and sarcastic jabs, and soon everyone was aware of the tension between us. It was like a ticking bomb ready to go off. One Friday during gym, things escalated. We were doing some ridiculous obstacle course Coach Rick found on YouTube, and of course, Jackson had to get under my skin again. I was paired with a blonde girl from math. I called her Mary Poppins because her actual name was impossible to remember, but it rhymes similarly. Anyway, Mary Poppins and I were paired to race one another through the obstacle course, and as expected, I blitzed through the course, leaving poor Mary behind to eat my proverbial dust. And then it all went sour quickly. As I reached the top of the wall ready to ring the bell, the ground shifted beneath me. I fell hard, almost dislocating something, but the padding softened the blow. I had barely even begun to get my bearings right when Jackson appeared next to me, grinning like a damn maniac as I desperately tried to make sense of what had happened. "Easy there, numbnuts. Don't go ruining our gym floors," Jackson cackled. "Did you?" "Yes," Jackson cut me off. "I yeeted you off the wall," he pointed to the platform I had just fallen from. I got up, wiping off all the scruff marks as Coach Rick looked me over to make sure I had not sustained any serious injuries. "You seem to be having a little too much fun racing Modesta Popea here," Jackson gestured to Mary Poppins, who was now just completing the final leg of the obstacle course. Other than his impeccable command of the Hungarian accent, I was surprised he knew her by her name. "All right, pretty boy. If you think you can fare better than her, be my guest," I thumbed the starting line. "You're challenging me to a race?" Jackson was very amused, like the mere thought baffled him. "Seeing as you booted me off the damn wall, I think showing you up is the least I can do without having to bash your face in." Coach Rick perked up at the threat. "Settle down, boys. I won't tolerate violence of any kind here," he warned as he tried to tear Mary Poppins away from the victory bell she was aggressively ringing. Yeah, he wouldn't be condoning violence of any kind because being pushed from several feet didn't count as violence. 10 minutes later, it took all of 10 minutes to pry Mary Poppins away from the bell and reset the course for Jackson and me. A full minute into the course and Jackson was already pulling ahead. "Don't go falling behind now, numbnuts," Jackson taunted, scaling the first wall like it was nothing. "You wish." I was right behind him, of course, and I had to fight the urge to not mistakenly nudge him off the course. Beating him here fair and square would be the first step in destroying his hold and reputation at Redwood. 4 minutes in and we both hit the final obstacle at the same time, scrambling up the climbing wall like our lives depended on it. I was panting, my arms burning in protest, but I wasn't going to let him win. There was too much at stake. Thankfully, I reached the top first, barely, and that's when it happened. Just as I was about to ring the winning bell, Jackson grabbed my wrist from behind, and for a split second, it was like time stopped. There were a number of things running through my mind the moment he made contact, but none of them prepared me for the burning sensation that immediately pooled in my gut, or the lightheadedness that accompanied the physical contact. "Not bad, numbnuts. You almost had me eating my words there," Jackson said, his voice lower than usual. "Almost?" I asked incredulously. Looking between him and the bell he kept me away from. "Yeah, almost. You see, the truth is, you've only got two options here. Either you let me ring the bell first, or you have yourself a quick trip down memory lane." Jackson's grip on my wrist loosened, but he didn't let go. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. "What the hell are you?" Jackson, without warning, let his smirk shine through for a split second before shoving me off the wall again. I landed harder than the first time. My breath was knocked out of me as I hit the mat. My vision blurred, and for a moment I just lay there, stunned at the not-so-surprising turn of events. When I finally managed to sit up, Jackson was already climbing down, that infuriating smirk still plastered on his face. "I'm sorry, but you were taking too long to make up your mind," he laughed, leaving me fuming on the floor with more questions than answers. 4 days later. Things only got weirder between Jackson and me over time. I had a lot of time to think over the course of the weekend, and the conclusions I arrived at were less than savory. I knew what I had felt when it was just Jax and I high up on that wall. For one second, I could have sworn that I felt, well, butterflies. Yes, right before he booted me off the second time, Jackson and I had a moment, and I could swear I didn't dream it up. I got the much-needed proof the following Tuesday in the boys' locker room. I liked having the locker room to myself, so I usually took my time after practice while everyone else went to freshen up. There I was in a towel, strolling from the shower to my locker when I saw Jackson standing there just as bare. Water dripped from his hair as he toweled off. He turned around and we stared at each other in silence, the tension thick and slightly awkward. "What, are you stalking me now?" he asked, all smug. I opened my mouth to snap back, but what came out was, "You really think you're all that, don't you?" He blinked, looking almost surprised for a second before that infuriating smirk returned. "Don't be shy, numbnuts," he said, stepping closer, eyes gleaming. "I take it you like what you see?" My heart pounded. "Stalking you? Please, I'd rather watch paint dry," I said, though my voice wavered. He chuckled, the sound sending heat to my face. "You'd have a lot more fun watching me, I can promise that much." The locker room suddenly felt 10 degrees hotter. I took a step back, but Jackson closed the gap instantly, his bare chest now inches from mine. I could smell his soap, something woodsy and crisp, and my brain went foggy with each breath. "You can't take your eyes off me, huh?" he murmured, leaning in. His breath tickled my ears, snapping me out of my daze. "Back off, Jackson," I warned, trying to sound firm. He pulled back just a little, meeting my eyes. "Say the word, and I'll walk away right now." I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. My brain screamed at me to tell him to leave, but my body wouldn't cooperate. "Don't go quiet now, numbnuts," Jackson nudged. I blinked hard, shaking myself out of it. "Get over yourself," I muttered, but we both knew I didn't mean it. Jackson raised both hands in surrender, intentionally showcasing his severely toned body, his smirk never leaving his face. The bell rang and Jackson spoke up again. "That's my cue, numbnuts. Maybe we should try this again when you grow a pair," he said, as he tossed his towel in the bin and nudged me out of the way with his shoulder. "See you around." 4 days later. After the locker room incident, I needed some time to regroup. My body had betrayed me. I wasn't a prude, but I'd somehow developed a thing for Jackson Strauss, and, to make matters worse, I think he knew. I spent the next few days carefully trying to avoid running into Jackson into confined spaces because the rules of our little back and forth had changed drastically. I spent the next few days avoiding Jackson in tight spots, but his friends seemed to take pleasure in starting trouble with me. I didn't know if Jackson ordered it or just turned a blind eye, but each of them needed time off from school to physically recover from the damage I dealt. It was precisely one of those instances Mrs. Henderson had come to break off today. I had just finished off one of Jackson's lackeys and was about to make a break for it when I found the he-devil casually lounging against the locker with his trademark grin in place. We proceeded to have a standoff, one that had no doubt made old Western movies proud, but Mrs. Henderson was having none of it. She hauled us off straight to detention, no questions asked. The crazy thing is, I had planned to go sightseeing around town today after school. A real shame. Seeing as it was after school hours, Mrs. Henderson didn't have any trouble finding an empty classroom and throwing us in. Detention for 3 hours after school every day for the rest of the week. That was the deal, and it was a fair one in my opinion. But for some reason, Jackson couldn't bring himself to sit still. "You know, pacing around isn't going to make the time move any faster," I groaned as I pinched the bridge of my nose. It was dizzying watching him go back and forth. Jackson, deep in thought, didn't bother with a reply, so I did what anyone else in my position would have. I threw a dictionary at him, clocking him on the side of the head. "What the literal fuck?" Jackson asked in genuine shock as he massaged the point of impact. I shrugged. "I've been trying to get you to quit it for a while now." "Quit what?" "Your pacing. It was driving me nuts." "So you needed to get me to stop pacing, and the only way you could think of doing that was to throw a bloody hardcover at me?" "Of course not," I scoffed. "That was just me being creative," I said matter-of-factly. That response seemed to set Jackson off. "This is all your fault. I shouldn't even be here," he spat. It was hard to reconcile this angry Jackson with the one I'd encountered in the locker room a few days ago, but unfortunately, they were the same person. "Yeah, sure, blame me for all your problems, why don't you? Let's just pretend like you not being loved as a child has nothing to do with this." Jackson didn't take kindly to the jab. "Shut it," he snarled, grabbing a fistful of my collar. "Make me!" I shoved him off of me without wasting any time, butterflies be damned. I was more than ready to have the final showdown with Jaxon right here and now, but then something unexpected happened. His phone, which had clattered to the ground around the time I had shoved him, lit up with a call. It was a call from a Jazz. My initial thought was a girlfriend of sorts, but the theory was out of the window when the caller ID displayed a little girl no older than 8 years old with a huge grin on her face, an eerily familiar grin. Baby sister. Had to be. The resemblance was uncanny. "Hey, Jazz, I was just about to call you," he stammered as he placed the phone on his ear. I couldn't entirely make out what the little girl was saying to him, but she did not sound thrilled. She seemed to be laying into him, too, if the look on his face was anything to go by. "What? Of course, I'm still coming. I was just about leaving school when I was called back to help with the presentation." I gasped at the apparent lie, and Jax turned to me with fury blazing in his eyes. "Fuck this up, I dare you." I turned away from him, giving him some much-needed privacy. "Don't worry, Jazz, I'll be there within the hour. I promise I won't miss your big presentation." Jaxon hung up and ran a hand through his hair, cursing. "Seems like you've got somewhere to be," I stated casually. "Stay out of it," Jaxon hissed. I suspected that something about how casual my tone was got under his skin. "All I'm saying is the little girl sounded upset. You're not going to miss her presentation, are you?" I continued in the same breath. Strangely enough, Jaxon didn't take the bait or lose his cool. Rather, he seemed distant and a little too melancholic for my taste. He glared at the desk directly in front of him for a few terse seconds before cursing and kicking it across the room, clearly enraged. I didn't understand why Mrs. Henderson thought leaving us alone in an empty classroom was a good idea, but she must have realized her mistake when she burst into the room fuming. "What's all this noise?" she demanded. Thinking quickly on my feet, I clutched my stomach and dropped to the floor, groaning loudly. Mrs. Henderson, mid-rant, shot me an annoyed look. "What now?" she snapped. "I don't feel so good," I mumbled, pretending to be in agony. "I think I need the nurse." Jaxon stood there shocked, to say the least. He clearly had never seen such masterful theater on display. "You're not faking this, are you?" Mrs. Henderson asked, hands on her hips. I groaned louder, holding my gut. "Why would I lie? Please, it's bad." With a heavy sigh, she relented. "Fine, let's go." As I got back on my feet, I winked at Jaxon, savoring the look of shock and begrudging gratitude on his face. It didn't need to be said that he owed me one, a huge one at that, because I ended up getting poked by the school nurse, Greta, before I was allowed to leave school that day. 3 days later. Ever since the detention incident, things had sort of mellowed out between Jaxon and me. Not like we didn't want to still beat each other senselessly, but we could now sit in the same room without sending death glares or signaling that we'd throw down at any second. I wasn't stupid. Jaxon would never admit it, but I figured my little stunt in detention had softened whatever ice encased his big bully heart. I spotted him in the cafeteria, sitting alone, and I decided to mess with him a bit. With a tray of food in hand, I slid into the seat next to him, completely ignoring the dozen other empty tables around us. Jaxon groaned, not even bothering to look up from his plate. "You could literally sit anywhere else," he muttered, voice low and annoyed. He was obviously not in the mood. "Yeah, but I like to live dangerously," I said with a smirk, leaning back and making myself comfortable. "So, how'd your sister's recital go?" His fork froze midway to his mouth. He turned to me, brow furrowed in suspicion. "How do you even know it was my sister?" I shrugged, taking a bite of my sandwich. "First of all, she's got you totally whipped. I could tell from that one phone call. You were practically groveling." Jaxon narrowed his eyes but said nothing, so I continued. "And then there was that grin on her caller ID. She's got the same devilish look you pull when you're about to do something stupid. No one outside your immediate family could nail that. I'm certain it's a family trait." Jaxon let out a frustrated sigh, finally dropping his fork. "You're really something, you know that?" "Yeah, I get that a lot," I smiled smugly, waiting for him to spill about the recital. He leaned back, crossing his arms, but I could see the tension slowly leave his shoulders. "It went fine. She was great." "See? Was that so hard?" I asked, nudging him slightly with my elbow. Jaxon scowled and shoved me in return, sending me tumbling to the cold cafeteria floors. I couldn't even blame him this time. I more than had it coming. 1 week later. It was now obvious that Jaxon and I had one very glaring thing in common: solitude. Like me, he had no real friends. Whether that was a personal preference or a side effect of his reputation at Redwood remained unknown to me. Over time, Jax and I began to hang out. It started off as non-consensual stuff, running into each other by the river or on the overpass. Weirdly enough, we had similar choices in hangout locations after school. After running into each other more often than not, we finally decided to silently tolerate each other's presence. Time had a weird way of working at school. Some days felt like months, and some months like days. Over the days, our silence turned into small talk, and a week later, we found ourselves sharing soda on the overpass. And that's how I single-handedly ended Mike's reign as top dog at Redwood, Jaxon said, recounting how he was once like me at Redwood High, a nameless nobody stirring up trouble before claiming the throne for himself. You know, the only reason I'm still nameless, like you so delicately put it, is because I'm yet to beat your lights off, I reminded him. All I'm hearing are excuses, man. If you really couldn't stand me the way you claim, then you'd have done something about it. I've heard all about you and all the things you did at your former school, he said, half shuddering. He was right. These days, I'd been having fewer and less reasons to destroy him. He had sort of grown on me these last few weeks. Sure, I was very attracted to him, but that had never stopped me in the past. Just ask Woody Nelson. I loved that boy to bits back in middle school, but I still had to do him in when he crossed the line that one time at Betty Foster's bar mitzvah. Let's just say your time hasn't come yet, Jax. Jaxon laughed. Sure, keep telling yourself that. We both know that's not true. Oh, and what's the truth? I can't say for sure, but I've got some theories. This I want to hear. Lay them on me, I said, turning to face him. Jax nodded before continuing. First of all, I think you're actually terrified of me, and all that tough talk is just hot air. I stroked my chin in response. Interesting theory. What's your personal take? Jaxon crushed his can. I don't think it's all hot air. I've seen how you handle yourself in a scuffle. So you've been watching me then, I teased lightly. Of course I have, and that brings me to my second theory. I was interested in seeing where this was going. Which is? Well, I suspect that you're completely and utterly in love with me. Jaxon carelessly shrugged. And if I wasn't aware of how twisted he could be, then I might have been taken off guard by his words. Those are bold claims, Jaxon, I commented offhandedly, holding his gaze. Do you happen to have any proof to back these claims? Jaxon shrugged again. There's no need for that. I see the way you look at me when you think no one's looking. And don't even get me started on the locker room run-in. You couldn't take your eyes off me, Jaxon taunted. I cleared my throat as I fought back a monumental blush. I still got a little lightheaded when I thought about the locker room encounter. You're concluding based on those incidents? Those are purely circumstantial. I tried to defend myself. But Jaxon wasn't having it. He stepped forward, his nose almost touching mine. So if I asked you to kiss me right now, you wouldn't. Now I was completely at a loss. How did we even arrive here? What the hell are you talking about all of a sudden? I stammered. Jaxon took a half step forward now, our noses almost touching. It's a simple yes or no question, numbnuts. The heat spread all over my face rapidly. I hated being in situations like these. See, you can't even deny it, Jaxon whispered, his breath tickling my lips. His blue gaze held my brown, daring me to break our little stare contest. I held strong. What I did not expect was for Jaxon to put his hands on me. His hands were on both sides of my face in an instant, and before I could voice my concerns, he pulled me in. There was nothing forceful about the action. It was more like a little nudge, and my body followed through wholeheartedly. Jackson's lips were softer than I could have ever imagined, and he didn't waste any time asserting control over the situation. We eventually broke apart, both faces flushed from exertion. That wasn't as bad as I thought it'd be, Jaxon said, wiping his lips with the back of his sleeve. I nodded, not trusting myself with words at the moment. There were no fireworks or anything of the sort, but the exchange almost made me dizzy. We spent the remaining hour in relative silence, both of us no doubt wondering where we could go from here. 1 month later. The kiss changed everything between Jaxon and I, and not in the way you would think. Turns out that Jaxon was just as smitten with me as I was with him, and what occurred over the course of the next 3 weeks was nothing short of a tryst for the ages. It kicked off from the locker room when we ran into each other by accident again. Almost like last time, I was grabbing my stuff when Jaxon strolled in with a smirk intact. I could have sworn he was going to give me some snarky remark, but instead, he just kept coming closer. You know, we really have to stop meeting like this, he eventually said. I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't do anything about the smile that followed. Maybe you're just following me around. Without warning, he closed the distance between us. 1 second, I was standing there, trying to look unbothered, and the next, his lips were on mine, firm but soft, pushing me back against the cool metal of the lockers. His hand slid up to my waist, pulling me closer, and I could have sworn I could feel his heart pounding against my chest. It wasn't rushed, more like a slow burn that made every second mean something. Jaxon eventually pulled back slightly, his eyes half-lidded. "You know," he murmured, lips brushing mine as he spoke, "you don't always have to play hardball with me, numbnuts. It's okay to be excited to see me." I laughed softly, but it was shaky. "I still stand on the fact that you need to get over yourself." Sure. I'll do that as soon as you do," he whispered, inching closer to kiss me again. The sound of a door opening snapped us both out of it, and the janitor walked in. Thankfully, he was distracted by a phone call he was on and paid us no mind. We easily snuck out of sight and bade each other farewell until third period. Later that day, despite almost getting caught making out in the locker room, it didn't stop us from going at it in the bathroom, at detention, and even under the bleachers at the gym. Redwood's greatest hits, he had called it. Jaxon took it upon himself to find the most challenging places to get intimate, and I loved challenges. Over the course of the month, a lot of things became pretty clear to us. Well, to me precisely. The first was that misery loved company. I think this went without saying, but Jaxon and I had come to enjoy our private moments where it was just us and our threats flying back and forth. He and I were by no means in love with one another, not yet at least. We understood that we just liked spending time with each other more than anything else. Thankfully, neither of us was the type to confuse things for anything other than what it was. This led to the second discovery. Time was not on our side. We were both treading familiar territory, and we had to be careful. On that note, the most complicated thing we had to navigate was ruling Redwood High. "It's really not that deep for me, to be honest," I had said to him under the bleachers one afternoon. "You can remain top dog." Jaxon frowned. "You make it seem like you're allowing me or giving me permission." I chuckled at how much it bothered him. "Call it what you want, but I've decided that as long as you don't take it too far with the other students, I won't have to intervene and end your reign here." Tough talk from someone who can't keep his hands off me. I shrugged in response. "I'll admit you do have me there, but I assure you that I have no difficulty separating business from pleasure." Jaxon nodded in understanding. "I'll take your word for it." We shook hands on the matter, and that was that. The rest of Redwood didn't know it yet, but there was now a new power dynamic. 1 week later. There are 1,000,001 ways my arrival at Redwood High could have played out, but the last route I expected to find myself on was that of a relationship with a school bully. Calling it a relationship was a bit of a stretch, to be honest. He liked me and I liked him, but everything outside of that was just complicated. That was until Jaxon decided to level with me. One night, about a week before we were set to graduate, we found ourselves sitting on the roof of his car, watching the stars like we'd done 100 times before. Jaxon had gone quiet, which usually meant he was thinking about something serious. "What's on your mind?" I asked, nudging him with my elbow. He turned to me, his usual smirk nowhere in place. "So, I've been thinking," he paused, and for once, it seemed like he was nervous. "What if we didn't end this after high school?" I blinked surprise. "You mean—" "Yeah," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't want this to be just a high school thing. I want us to be more than that. Like, I don't know, boyfriends, officially?" It took me a second to process. Jaxon Strauss was asking me to be his boyfriend, and in the most awkward yet endearing way possible. "You're serious?" I asked, my voice quiet. "As a heart attack," he replied, grinning nervously. "So, what do you say?" I nudged him a little harder with my elbow. "I thought you'd never ask." "Of course, I say yes." From that moment on, things between us shifted by a fair margin. We weren't just physical anymore. It was real now, and it felt right. And by the end of the week, when Mary Poppins gave the valedictorian speech on the day of graduation, I couldn't help but wonder how things would have played between Jaxon and myself if we had to actually battle it out as I had initially thought we would have to. Conclusion. Fast forward a couple of years, and Jaxon and I end up at the same college, Cedar Creek University. Now, it wasn't the original plan, but after graduation, he decided to take some time off from his family's business and made good on his promise of going to college together. No one at college knew about our past at Redwood, or the way we used to butt heads. All they saw about us now was a couple who clicked, a couple who had each other's backs no matter what. Looking back, it's crazy to think about how far we'd come, from wanting to rip each other a new one to being inseparable. It really is strange how things tend to play out. The end. Have you ever had feelings for a bully? How did you work around it? Thanks for watching. Consider subscribing to become part of our Rainbow Force. And stay wholesome.